Good afternoon, everyone. My name is DM Rawlings, the 10-Minute DM. I'm an experienced Forged in the Dark GM, and I'm here to offer some advice 10 minutes at a time. And today, I thought we'd talk about insight checks in Forged in the Dark games. So recently, I watched the most recent session of Candela Obscura on Critical Role, and several times throughout that series, and in that episode as well, I saw characters making rolls trying to infer an NPC's motives. In D&D, we'd call that an insight check, but in Candela Obscura, we'd call it a read action roll. And looking at how these two systems handle these rolls is a really great way to illustrate the differences in mindset between the two systems. But before we dive into how they're different, I wanted to start with looking at how they're actually similar to each other. In both D&D and Forged in the Dark, this roll is not a lie detector. We can get an impression that someone's being evasive or that there's something more to the situation than they're letting on, but it's not a guarantee. It's more about a feeling. D&D specifically has a spell called Zone of Truth, and Blades in the Dark has an ability called like Looking at a Mirror that actually do this. And it's just not a good practice to overshadow those magical and special abilities with skill checks that anyone can perform. Secondly, in most cases, almost nothing bad can happen from making an insight roll like this. The worst thing is a character maybe doesn't get the result that they were looking for, but it doesn't get any worse, and I would like you to remember this for a little bit later as the discussion continues. So now, let's talk about how they differ from each other. In D&D, number 1, we assign the check a DC based on how difficult the subject is to read. So, someone's difficult to read, we set the target number higher. If they're an easy to read, we set the target number lower. And in Candela Obscura, we don't really have something that directly relates to this. There's no sense of difficulty on rolls. Or rather, it's not there explicitly in the rules. For most Forged in the Dark games that are out there, there's this thing called effect. And effect is a measure of how effective an action roll is going to be. And we can pull this directly into Candela Obscura to help us out in situations like these. So what we'd be saying with effect is the more skilled the target is at deception, the less your PCs are going to get from a successful roll. If someone's really easy to read, you might find out exactly what they're lying about. Or if someone's harder to read, you may only figure out that there's some kind of vibe off with them, right? As GMs, we tend to do this subconsciously anyways, so I say go ahead and just follow the fiction and insert this into your game. The second area where things are different is that in D&D, when you fail, the only thing that happens is you don't get what you want. But in Candela Obscura and other Forged in the Dark games, if you get a 1 to 5 as your highest die, there's going to be some kind of consequence. And that means that the breadth of possible outcomes, with mixed successes and critical successes as well, differs between the two. Any consequence that you get in a Forged in the Dark game is going to move the story forward, and the same test probably shouldn't happen again. So it kind of begs a question to me, which is what brought me to this topic in the first hand, is should we even be rolling at all? I've mentioned before that in Candela Obscura, if there are no stakes for a roll, that roll just shouldn't happen. And just earlier today, I said it's rare that something bad will happen when making an insight check. So my recommendation is, in a case where an NPC has nothing to hide, maybe just outright tell the players without a roll that this person seems to be, you can take them at face value. And I know what you're thinking. If you only roll when someone is hiding something, then the players themselves are going to know when something's up. And that's 100% true. But Forged in the Dark games are very much more about trust in comparison to D&D. As GMs, we're trusting that our players are going to act in good faith and work collectively to tell the best story possible. And they're going to use out-of-game information in a responsible way that best suits the fiction. So, again, I recommend making a choice to trust your table and then allowing your table to surprise and delight you. But what if you decide to roll? The most likely outcome when you roll in Candela Obscura is a mixed success when you're rolling between 2 and 4 dice. And players should want to avoid shallower rolls, since doing so can introduce more tension into the game. And like I said before, if we're going to be doing this, the stakes for the roll are going to be low. So maybe we should just run through a few example consequences of what some kind of insight check might be. So if we were looking at worst position, then maybe the NPC is going to notice your watchful gaze and get a little bit more defensive, and things are going to be harder going forward. Or maybe for reduced effect, the NPC's distracted. They're harder to read because they have something going on that makes them more difficult to assess. We can look at harm. The NPC has some kind of magic charm that inflicts brain damage on those that scrutinize them. Obviously, that's a bit of a stretch, and I'll admit it, but I wanted to cover all of the major categories here. What about a lost opportunity? The NPC immediately after the roll is made is pulled away. They have something that they have to attend to. They cannot be questioned further. Or maybe a loose end. The NPC plans to look into your character due to the unusual behavior that they were exhibiting. Right? Or lastly, complication. It turns out the NPC actually did have something to hide. And I want to dwell on this last point just a little bit more. In my previous video about complications, and I'll post that video above, I talked about holding on loosely to the plot of your story. And here's an example of that in play. The assignment doesn't mention if this NPC has anything to hide, either for him hiding something or against him hiding something. But when a consequence comes up, we can do whatever we want because that fiction hasn't been established yet in the game. Maybe the NPC is an Eon's informant. Maybe they have a beef with Candela Obscura due to something that happened in their past. Maybe they're secretly working for a crime family and don't want anyone poking around. Maybe they're strictly religious and they can't reconcile what they saw in this supernatural situation with their faith. Or maybe they just have some kind of secret and you don't know what that is, but you'll think about it later. The point is, sometimes the act of making an action roll to see if someone's hiding something can in fact magically, well, not magically, but can cause them to have something to hide in a Forged in the Dark game. So, I do hope that this helps illustrate how the mindset of a fiction-first game differs from D&D. Forged in the Dark focuses on creating a fun, shared story where every roll of the dice matters, and this separates it from more traditional games that focus on telling fun, GM-driven stories. I've been DM Rawlings, your 10-minute DM, and if you do enjoy these videos so far, please do subscribe, do the bell thing. I don't know. I'm not the biggest YouTube, action guy, but I would like if you did hit that subscribe button. Anyways, have a great day.